The agenda this week pondered the price we pay for shortened attention spans, examined elevated expectations for North American expressways, and asked where the arts should get their funding. The agenda's week in review begins with faith versus facts.
I started reading the literature on the science and religion relationship, and I realized that a lot of it was fallacious or tendentious, and eventually that research grew into that book. So.
You're clearly not religious now, but were you ever?
Yeah, I was raised as a Reformed Jew, but if you're in the States, you know that's about that far from being an atheist. I went to Hebrew school briefly, flunked out, and I had a deconversion experience when I was listening to Sgt. Pepper album.
You're not being facetious. I know, you said this in the book.
No, it's in the book, yeah. I don't...
The Beatles turned you off religion.
Yeah, and it's nothing that they said or did. Maybe it put me in some kind of frame of mind when I was listening to this album that I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was lying on the couch and all of a sudden I realized that everything that I had been taught about God, that there was no evidence for that. And so my very first deconversion experience was an evidence-based one. And I had 5 minutes of sort of psychic pain when I realized, oh, I'm not going to go to heaven. I'm going to be interred and turned into worm food. And then after that, I've been, a non-believer ever since, and it's been okay.
There are those who make room for religion, and let's get into that expression right now. I think you call it accommodationism.
Yes.
What does that mean?
To me, it means the view that science and religion are mutually compatible, that they can be admitted together, that they can live harmoniously together in the human mind. And my contention is that that's a point of view which is false, that it's two different ways of looking at the universe that are not compatible.
Who are the accommodationists today?
Well, there's a lot of them. I mean, every science-friendly religionist, every scientist who is religious is an accommodationist, because they have these two different ways of looking. There are also many scientific organizations issue statements saying that science and religion are not incompatible. We're two separate magisteria, they call them, that one of them dealing with values and morals, the other dealing with the natural world. And so many atheists are accommodationists because if we're interested, for example, in selling evolution to an evolution-resistant American public, and more than half of the American public, the US public, doesn't like evolution, then they say we have to placate our religious friends by telling them that science and religion are not at odds with their faith. And that way they'll be on our side, that way they'll accept evolution. The problem is that strategy hasn't worked very well.
That's just politics though, isn't it?
It is, and in their more candid moments they'll admit this is a tactical method rather than something they really believe in their hearts.
The late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, whom you knew, I'm sure.
Yes, he was on my thesis committee. So.
Okay. His idea that science and religion do not overlap, he wrote as follows. Science and religion are not in conflict, for their teachings occupy distinctly different domains. The lack of conflict between science and religion arises from a lack of overlap between their respective domains of professional expertise, science in the empirical constitution of the universe, and religion in the search for proper ethical values and the spiritual meaning of our lives. The attainment of wisdom in a full life requires extensive attention to both domains. You think he's wrong, but why do you think he's wrong?
Absolutely. I go into it again in the book. It would basically for two reasons. First of all, he limits religion to meanings, morals, and values. He says that explicitly in his book. Religionists and theologians have not reacted well to that because they will say explicitly that we are basing our religion on certain assertions about the real world that are true. For Christianity, it's that Jesus was the Son of God, came to earth and was resurrected. For Jews, it's other things. For Hindus and Muslims, it's other claims. So it's not just about meaning, morals, and values. It's about those things and the sense of community, but they're grounded on certain truths about the world. So by and large, that claim that religion is restricted to this domain has been rejected, not by scientists, but by theologians who have rejected Gould's claim. The other claim that Gould makes, which is that religion is the purview of meaning, morals, and values, is also wrong because he neglected the fact that there's a huge history, a long history of secular analyses of philosophy and ethics, beginning with the ancient Greeks, going through Kant, Hume, Spinoza, John Stuart Mill, and all the way up to people like Anthony Grayling and Peter Singer today, who deal with ethics, meanings, morals, and values without ever mentioning the supernatural or a deity. So Gould, defined these realms to be separate, but when you actually look at how they operate, they're not. There's considerable overlap.
In the past, I think we've always had to really just look at one perspective or the other. People often just take science and what science can say about the world, or they might take religious views and say, well, the religious explanation explains everything that we need to know. And for me, what I think that this new field of neurotheology can do is to say, well, what can we learn from religious and spiritual beliefs? What can we learn from science? And how can we bring them together? Can we learn something about ourselves as human beings, about the beliefs that we hold? Why do we hold them? How do we hold them? And how does that affect us? How does it influence our own thought processes, our brain processes, and even how it affects our body and our health?
I don't have to tell you, there are people like evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne who believe that it is absolutely incompatible for science and religion to have anything in common. Do you agree with him?
Well, no, I don't. In fact, to me, it's almost incompatible to say that because there are so many people who believe that it's compatible. There are so many scientists, including people like the head of the National Institute of Health, people who work at the Vatican Astronomical Observatory, and many medical doctors who do not see a clear and absolute conflict between science and religion. Now, of course, I think part of what happens when we make these kind of blanket statements about the compatibility of science and religion is that sometimes people have a very narrow view of what either science can say or what religious or spiritual ideas can say. And I think that sometimes people think, all right, well, when somebody says they're religious, they believe that the world had to be created in 6 days and maybe 5,000 years ago. That may be difficult to correspond with anything scientific, and I would certainly agree with that. However, there are so many different aspects of religious and spiritual beliefs that don't necessarily have to be incompatible with what science can say. And of course, if science is going to take a look at the natural world and take a look at who we are as human beings, then considering that there are billions of people who are religious, I think it makes complete sense to utilize science as a way of helping us to understand what religious and spiritual beliefs are all about.
Part of the problem of thinking about religion as faith or belief, it leads us to not think about religion as family, as community, as the food you eat, as your approach to things like war, peace, pacifism, women's rights, these kinds of things. And so I think as someone whose work is the job of studying religion, it's always important to me to think about it both in the ways people practice it and in material forms.
Because I mean, for the new atheists, religion is not about practice and lived religion, right? It's about a set of beliefs that are either testable scientifically or not. So for them, I mean, Richard Dawkins calls his book the God Delusion, and then Victor Stenger, who is kind of a new atheist, calls it God the Failed Hypothesis, right? And so they see it as a list of kind of testable hypotheses that scientifically you should be able to find proof about, and if there's no proof, then it's a failed hypothesis. And if you can't even test it because science is based on kind of empirical testing, then it's not scientific, right? And so they see it as a kind of intellectual exercise, and this is why they kind of venture into talking about religious people as either stupid or dangerous, because they see people as, you have a set of hypotheses that you have no evidence for, and you still continue to believe it, and therefore something must be wrong with you, right? And so they don't see it as a lived practice of community, of those kinds of things, which are just as, if not more important to how people live their life as religious people than just a bunch of things that you tick off on a box.
The second president of your country, John Adams, said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Does that still stand up today?
That's, you took one of my favorite quotes from American history. The United States was founded on a proposition that was unique. Whether one agrees with it or not, it was unique, that the government should be small. We should maximize individual liberty. But the founders knew what I know, and what every religious Jew and Christian knows, and what everyone knew before the Enlightenment, that human nature is flawed, and I'm being very generous. I'm almost prepared to say stinks, but flawed. So how could flawed people have a good society if the state is not controlling their behavior? The only way is if I control my behavior by feeling that I am answerable to a just God and that I have a just system of ethics to govern my life. So it's entirely accurate what Adam said. That's why the bigger the government, the smaller the God. In Western, I'm not talking now in the Islamic world where they mesh the two, but in secular Europe, governments got bigger and bigger as religion got smaller and smaller. Somebody's going to have to control you. If you don't control you answerable to God and your religion, then you're going to have to answer to the government.
Are you concerned that on what seem to be sort of the big, call them conservative, liberal, left, right, however you want to characterize them, issues of the day, the conservative side looks like it's losing on just about all of them? Why do you think you are losing on all of them?
Because it's very hard for people who are not raised with the belief that they have to first change themselves to grasp the profundity of that message. When John Kennedy said in 1961 in his inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," that was classic liberalism, which is what I still love. But right now, it is the opposite. Ask what your country can do for you. When you raise a generation with that belief, what can you do for me? I'm going to vote for the person who takes care of me. Why do single women have such disproportionate votes for the left? Because the left says, we'll take care of you. You don't need a husband. Do you know that married women with children are just as Republican as white men? And it doesn't matter generally what the ethnicity of the woman is. If she's married and has children, she votes Republican. Single and children, the most Democrat, because they will take care of me.
But you're talking economic issues, and I'm also thinking of I was thinking of social issues as well. Whether
social
it's
issues?
Gay marriage or euthanasia or abortion or capital punishment. The conservative side in the United States at the moment seems to be losing the debate.
I agree with you. Losing doesn't mean you're wrong, but losing, that is correct, yes. Because it sounds, the default position in America and in the West today is liberal or left. That's the default position. You know, what do I care if two men love each other? Who am I to say that's not a beautiful love? I don't say it's not a beautiful love. And in my own extended family are two women who are married, and they have two kids, and I love those kids every bit as much as I do any of my other nieces and nephews, et cetera, et cetera. But I am against the redefining of marriage because, among many other reasons, and it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. Marriage equality fits on a bumper sticker. To say that we haven't been wrong for 7,000 years in society by having marriage defined as male-female takes a lot more than a bumper sticker. And the biggest problem is what it announces is gender doesn't matter. And this is what I really worry about. We are playing with the next generation.
Can we start with that subtitle, on becoming an individual in an age of distraction? What makes this an age of distraction?
Well, it seems like we're living through a kind of cultural crisis of attention, a widespread sense of mental fragmentation, a sense that our attention is not simply ours to direct as we want. And I think it often makes us feel that what's at stake is something really big, something like whether it will be possible to maintain a coherent self, just a self that's able to act according to settled purposes and ongoing projects rather than flitting around.
I know what we're distracted by, right? All the screens, the shows, everything in life, okay? What are we distracted from, in your view?
That's a great question. I think our distractibility, one way you could read it is that it means we're agnostic on the question of what is worth paying attention to, that is, what to value. And if you look at it that way, I think it is the tip of a much larger cultural iceberg, which is a kind of crisis of values, where we're not sure exactly where we stand.
But we've invented dishwashers because theoretically we didn't want to spend the time at the sink after dinner. And we've invented washers and dryers because theoretically we didn't want to spend, okay, you get where I'm going with this. Yeah. So aren't we therefore more free and more independent thanks to the fact that we do less with our hands?
Well, certainly the progress of technology has opened up all kinds of areas for human endeavor that wouldn't be possible at all. I love to ride motorcycles, so there's a bit of technology that I'm very fond of. It's also, you mentioned freedom, sort of these things freeing us. That's certainly true. It's also true that I think the language of freedom has become the language of marketing. So there's a sort of sly appropriation of this, our most cherished ideal, really, of freedom. So the credit card offer says, no limits, you're in charge. And to free oneself from all this liberation introduces a bit of cognitive dissonance. So in other words, I think we need a different concept than freedom when what we're talking about is trying to overcome this sense of fragmentation. In the book, I offer these case studies of skilled practices. So I talk about the short order cook, hockey players, which you might appreciate up here.
Big hit in Canada, for sure.
Yeah, motorcycle racers, and people who build musical instruments. And what's interesting about these case studies, where I just spend a lot of time with people doing these things and talking to them, is that this perception of a skilled practitioner seems to get tuned to, it's almost like an ecological niche of action that they begin to inhabit, such that the distracting proliferation of choices is kind of narrowed and they get into a state of focus. And when that happens, the burden of sort of self-regulation is really made lighter. It's no longer feels like discipline, it almost feels like surrender or abandon to this, this experience where you're savoring time. Things sort of slows down and dilates. It's very pleasurable.
Having you tell us what lessons from the 3 examples that we've done so far, Boston, New York, Houston, what lessons can Ontario's capital city learn from those experiences that we ought to apply to the situation here in the province of Ontario?
Sure. I think there are 3 major things. First, it seems to me that the impetus for urban expressway removal or discussions and rerouting is all based on the fact that more and more people want to live in tied together, cohesive, walkable, drivable, bikeable downtowns that aren't disrupted by major pieces of infrastructure. And in particular, they want access to the amenities and to the parts of town that are really drawing people back into central cities. So in Toronto, that might be the waterfront, and that's the case in New York as well. People want access to that space, and as I said, it creates a lot of good opportunities for new public spaces, new developments, and new futures for our cities. 2 other sort of broader things that I think are important to keep in mind is that these systems are a part, these elements are a part of much broader systems, and so that always needs to be a part of the conversation. So here in Houston, as I said, the Pierce Elevated, it's kind of a sexy topic. It's easy to talk about this elevated and what to do with it, but we often lose sight of the fact that this is a part of a huge overhaul of the entire system that's really going to change mobility for the entire metropolitan area. So I think that's a key component to maintain as a part of these conversations, that the big dig can't be separated from the rest of Boston's transit choices, be that mass transit, be that more roadways, whatever that entails, it needs to be a part of that. And then third and finally, these are systems that take a lot of time and take a lot of money, and recognizing the choices that we made 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it's really important for us to really think through what we're doing today, because the choices we're making right now are going to continue to persist up until 2040, 2050, and these are opportunities that come along for cities only very rarely because of how durable and how long-lasting our infrastructure is.
Well, in fact, we've been told that the decision the Toronto City Council made this week is meant to last 100 years. That's how important this decision is. I mean, we've been inundated by numbers over the last several months as this debate has progressed here in Toronto, and I wonder if your advice is, it doesn't matter what they say in terms of what it's going to cost or how long it's going to take, multiply by a factor of 5 or something. Is that probably right?
You know, I mean, the numbers and the estimates are always hard to wrap your head around. And I mean, going back to the big dig, there's belief that some people in Boston, some of the officials in Boston undersold the estimates. So it's always hard to know what is the truth in that matter and what the final cost is going to be. But as I said earlier, I think the bottom line is that it's really easy to say, we should be able to move. We shouldn't suffer congestion. I should be able to get to whatever parts of the city I want to, and these systems should just be there. That's often, I think, an assumption that many of us make, and we forget about the fact that these systems, you know, take 10, 20 years to plan and build, and it's not just because it is a politically contentious opportunity, right? It is politically contentious, but it's also just incredibly complicated engineering that is incredibly expensive. And I think for many of us today who didn't experience the building of the original highway systems, at least here in the United States, it's easy to say, oh, these highways are just here. It couldn't have been that bad to build them. It couldn't have been that disruptive. Why don't we build a new one, or why don't we do project X or Y, without really realizing that it is going to cost several billions of dollars and often tens of billions of dollars to do these major realignments and reconstructions.
The mayor may not have been elected to increase anyone's travel time, but everyone's travel time is increasing. And the idea that we can continue to move throughout the GTHA simply by car is not feasible. And so I think no matter what you do with the Gardiner Expressway, we're still going to have longer commutes until we get to a system that has the options for people to bike, walk, cycle, use transit in the same corridors where we have freeways now. That's the only way you reduce congestion and the only way you make the system function better.
That's 10, 20 years down the road,
It
though.
certainly is, yeah. But I think for a city like Toronto, we have to get, Steve, onto the global agenda. No pun intended. We have to get consistent with our global peers. Look at what London has done. Look at what Singapore has done. I heard this week that Beijing has built 1,000 kilometers of metro in the last 10 years. 1,000 kilometers of
subways?
metro of subway. Yes. And so, of course, they had Olympics and they had other funding, and it's a different, social model and so on. But if we want to remain economically competitive, this stagnation that we're in and this repeating of the status quo and the hybrid option, to be frank, is just keeping us on that same pace. We have to do something about congestion. It's the issue that is really suppressing the global economic competitiveness of this city.
Yeah, but I did hear city councilors say things like, okay, fine, you want to take down the Gardiner Expressway. All the people who now, and admittedly there weren't very many, I think there was a tiny percentage of people who used that chunk of the Gardiner Expressway to commute. But the fear was all of those people are going to then go into local neighborhoods and find those sort of side streets to make their commute on, which would infuriate the people who live there and the councillors who represent them.
Sure.
What do you do about that?
So whenever you make a change of this magnitude, it has to come with an alternative. And ideally, the alternative gets built before the change comes. So you can't tell people who have made, firms have made decisions to locate where they are. Companies have opened up businesses, shops, restaurants. People have chosen where to live and work and play based on the presence of the Gardiner Expressway. And you can't take that away in 1 or 2 years and say, that's going to go away. You've got to give a 10-year window to have that happen. And in that 10-year window, you should be thinking about what are the viable alternatives for that. So is it a transit line in that same corridor? Is it a bus rapid transit line? How are we going to accommodate those trips? And so if you were to take it down and provide nothing else, probably the local roads would become the alternative, and it would be problematic. But I don't think any good engineer or planner would make that decision. They would decide what are going to be the alternatives before we decide to take the Gardiner Expressway down.
There's a dirty word in all of this that doesn't come up, and that word is tolls.
Yes.
Once upon a time, they were on the table as an option to either fund new highways or new public transit developments, etc. No one says that anymore. Where is the place for tolls in this debate?
So we need a way to fund our transportation infrastructure. The most direct way to fund our transportation infrastructure is to have those who are consuming it pay for it. And I think there's one other key message that always gets lost in this discussion. If I want to drive on the Gardiner at 3:30 in the morning, there's very few other people who want to do that, right? And so the cost of driving on the Gardiner at that time is very low. But if I want to get on the Gardiner at 8 a.m. or at 5 p.m., everybody wants to be there at the same time. And just like any other good that we sell, we change the price of that good depending on how many people want it. And so the toll should be set such that it sends economic signals for people who have choices to travel when there is opportunities to do so without becoming congested. There's a lot of cities in the world where the price to enter a roadway changes as a function of the number of people on the road. And that's acceptable to people when there are viable alternatives. So we go back to the same question. First build the alternative, introduce tolls, gather up some revenue. The revenues can pay for whatever public investment you want to put into place prior to the introduction of tolls.
But if I hear you right, you've got to have that infrastructure in place before
Right.
you introduce
Right.
tolls.
But
So
if
you
we-
can't do tolls now.
I would not suggest tolls right away, but I would suggest that if we want to spend whatever it is, $1, $2, $5, $10 billion to recreate the downtown of Toronto, and we want to provide transit alternatives in that corridor, if it costs us $10 billion in public funds to do it now, but we're going to toll parallel freeways, we're going to toll 401, we're going to toll 427, what that gives us is a guaranteed revenue source to pay back the debt that the province has taken on to build that massive infrastructure.
I'm going to use a word now that I suspect all of you hate, but I mean, it's the reality of the business that you're in, and that is, do you have to be, Barry, let's start with you, do you have to be, do you have to seem, do you have to appear less elitist than you are in order to attract those new audiences, those more diverse audiences?
I think we have to be authentic. I think ultimately we have to be authentic. I've seen too many organizations pander to audiences in ways that are inauthentic, and so really that's Karen's commitment. I think what our experience has shown, so, sort of backing up what you've said, Jeff, that the new generation of audience wants to connect with the artist as a member of their community, as sort of a celebrity within their community. It's not an elitist thing. They want to know. They want to know that these people are among us and are part of our community and part of the fabric of our community. And so you'll see New York City Ballet did an amazing marketing campaign several years ago that was that you couldn't imagine. The editorials in the New York Times, the hateful editorials about how New York City Ballet was ruining the image of ballet by this marketing campaign because they took dancers and they put them in street clothes and had them talk about things other than ballet. And the reality was it was a transformational campaign. It was a really important campaign not only for New York City Ballet but for the field. And that's what we're finding here in Toronto is that the new generation of audience, again, younger people want to engage with the art form and want to engage with the artists. And we're really focused on making sure that those pathways are possible.
Well, this is going to be harder for Judith because you have mostly dead people whose work you are showing in your gallery, so it's hard to engage directly with the artist. But having said that, and again, you push back if I'm wrong here, but if there's a sense that mostly 50-year-old plus white women are going to the gallery, that seems like a fairly elite crowd. Do you have to be less elitist to prosper?
I think elitist tends to be shorthand for two things that we've already talked about. One is the exposure to participation in the arts as a child. So if your family chose arts organizations, arts events as part of their leisure activities, you're more likely to go as an adult. And the second is what Jorn talked about feeling a sense of needing pre-existing knowledge to participate, and that's our fault. If our labels next to our paintings speak in art speak from sort of a conversation between somebody with art knowledge and somebody else with art knowledge, then the art novice who tries to engage with that work of art feels left out of that conversation. So we're really working hard to change the conversation about art, because you're right, we don't have as many living artists, but we have a lot of art that people can engage with that lives on through time into contemporary.
In fact, the quote I've seen you give is that you need to have input from the hairdressers and the mechanics and the dry cleaners. What's special about that?
We're looking at trying to connect our passion with somebody else's passion. It's hard for people who work in arts organizations to believe that somebody else doesn't have the same deep need for music or art or dance as we do. And finding out what other people are passionate about and helping them imagine that in our setting and exploring those ideas through art for us helps us build a bridge between where our audience's passion lay and where ours lays.
And Jorn, you used the expression earlier on this program. You want your audiences to look more like the Toronto subway, like the people who go on the streetcars and the subway system. What kind of cultural change do you think is necessary for that transformation to take place?
I mean, I think it is also a little bit, the understanding of sort of, in Canada and the immigration model that sort of exists here in Canada. I think, that you come here, but you sort of keep your national identity in a way. It's not sort of this U.S. American idea where everyone sort of becomes this new American. I think that does change the way that people interact with culture, and that does change the way, you know, people interact with the city in a way, you know, because and there are obviously, I mean, there are mobility problems in, you know, in Toronto. I mean, have you tried at, you know, 6 o'clock or whatever when you know, would have to come to see, you know, to your curtain to come from Scarborough into downtown Toronto? It's awfully difficult, you know. So, I mean, those things are definitely, you know, they're definitely an issue in reaching that goal.
Let me throw this out here, and you guys tell me what you think about this. Maybe, is it possible that what is required in this city is not a kind of an anti-elitist approach to the institutions that you represent, but rather you need more elites from broader communities? You know what I'm getting at? Does that make sense to you, Barry?
But that would assume that economic status equivocates with interest in art, which I don't believe. You know.
No, but come on, it costs a lot of money to go
I
to
don't.
your
I
things,
think
right?
if you look at our economic model, yes, it would be helpful, no question. But when you talk about engagement in art, I don't agree. I don't think of the National Ballet of Canada as an elitist institution.
What's your cheapest ticket?
Cheapest ticket is $35. So, you know, I do think that we're working very hard to create pathways into the institution for people of a variety of different economic levels. We're delivering dance to school children across Ontario and across the country through our U-Dance program. So I like to think of the organization sort of from a 360-degree view, and I think it's a responsibility we all have as leaders to, in terms of demonstrating the relevance of these institutions in the communities we serve, and that it's not simply about Swan Lake at the Four Seasons Center for those 2,000 people sitting that night, that really we are a part of the fabric of this institution, of this city, of this province, and of this country.
True, but for that same $35, you know an adult can take a kid to go see a movie.
Yeah, and I also think that you see people putting the money together to bring their kids to see a ball game or a hockey game, and it's equally expensive. So I do think it's about choices.
Right. How about you? That issue I put on the table just a moment ago.
I think we are an elitist sector. I think in Toronto we have some of the most expensive art in the world, and certainly in North America. So it's not a very easy city to gain access to. And I think, you know, from the TSO's perspective, we need to reimagine the entire model. And I think in a way, and when people talk about the arts crisis and the decline of orchestras, the failure really is adaptability. The failure is our institutions, my institution, myself, to be able to reimagine how we change to meet the needs in a changing world. So certainly from an economic perspective, we can build something that's very expensive and very elite and serves, you know, very, very more rich people who basically support the institution. Or we can say, music's important. Music's important to everybody, and we have to reimagine what it is to be an orchestra in today's day and age with technology, with the Arts Education Challenge in a city with such great cultural diversity. I know for us, our cheap seat is $16, and that is a stretch for people, particularly for people who feel it's not for me, I've never been before, I'm not exposed. So
$16 is about the price of a movie, though. That's a pretty good deal.
It is about the price of a movie, but you know, that being said, I think there are a number of people who are already feeling like they've been excluded or told they're not rich enough, they're not white, they're not educated enough to come. So one of the things we have started to do is we give our orchestra, all of our orchestra members, our staff, our board, free VIP passes, so they go around the city through the day. And if they run into someone who says, you know, I've never been to the symphony, I've always wanted to go, they give those out, 2 free, like high-end tickets. So these would be more like the $150 tickets. And the first time you come, it's on us.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety if you want. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.